Brooks. I am the Executive Director of the Justice Teams Network, and this is our webinar series, We Take Care of Us. We do have closed caption as well as Spanish interpretation, if you need either of those things. Daniela?
Buenas tardes, gracias por venir. Tenemos problemas técnicos con la interpretación. Perdónanos y momentáneamente, ojalá vamos a estar con la opción para elegir español en la interpretación. Disculpa.
Oh, okay, all right, so there's some problems with the Spanish interpretation, but they are working on it. I'm sure the team will figure that out shortly. We do have ASL interpretation as well as closed captioning for those who need it. So this is the last of season 1 of the We Take Care of Us series, and it's really been about exploring models of community response to community crisis that do not lean on or lead with law enforcement, right? We know that the resources that we need to take care of ourselves exist inside of our communities and amongst our people, and do not rely or do not need to rely on the carceral state. And so particularly in this moment, you know, where the defund OPD call has turned into a national call to defund police across the country and reinvest in things that actually keep us safe. I think these webinars have done a great job of highlighting models that already exist and existed before this was sort of what is trending even in mainstream media. And so tonight we're gonna look at a We Take Care of Us model specifically tied to substance abuse and drug overdose. And I'm pleased to be joined by Kristen Marshall. Kristen Marshall is originally from Cary, North Carolina, but found home in San Francisco, where she has lived, loved, danced, I love that, and worked for the past 10 years, serving people who use drugs across communities and experiences. Currently, she works at the National Harm Reduction Coalition and manages the Drug Overdose Prevention and Education, or DOPE, project, San Francisco's overdose prevention program, and the largest single city community naloxone distribution program in the country. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So that's your very short bio. Why don't you tell folks about you and how you came to the work, and then we'll get into what you actually do.
Sure. So it is just excellent to be here. Thank you for having me. You know, like my bio says, I'm originally from North Carolina, and I moved to San Francisco and really was just blown away by like getting to bear witness to like the work that communities were doing that often was like just not being talked about. And so I kind of stumbled into the work. I used to work at universities and colleges in like residence halls, kind of managing the day-to-day operations and working closely with students who would, you know, that's like peak time in people's lives where they start to really come up against some challenges around coping around mental health stuff, and really kind of exploring what it means to cope and to explore new things and to experience new things, including drug use. And so it was like watching and had watched a lot of these kind of issues play out in communities that I was a part of. I always say that I, you know, have been loved by people who use drugs my entire life. I'm from a family of people who use drugs. I use drugs. Everyone that I love in the whole world uses drugs. And so I feel very lucky to be a part of those communities. And, you know, in the environments I was working in and, you know, my own friendship groups and my own family was watching people who had always loved me and cared for me, really suffer and struggle against a system that was telling them that just because they were making specific decisions for their bodies, that they lost their rights to like connect with services, connect with support, to be supported, and just kind of watching things play out in ways that just didn't make a lot of sense. But I also didn't have the language to understand why it didn't make sense. And so I stumbled into harm reduction work, and we can talk about kind of what that work is and the philosophy around it. But I stumbled into harm reduction work in San Francisco when I just decided to volunteer at a small syringe access program on 6th Street, which is in downtown San Francisco, kind of in the thick of a lot of what's going on and a lot of what's being televised across the country as like like our homeless crisis, our housing crisis. And so I found what I was looking for, and I didn't know that that's what I was looking for. I didn't know I was looking for another way to think about drug use. I didn't know that I was looking for another way to kind of process the world around me and how people were getting treated. And I especially didn't know that I was really gonna be changed pretty profoundly by the opportunity to get to work within communities that were taking care of themselves in the ways that they were. And so all that to say, you know, I started volunteering at syringe access programs. You know, the first time I learned how to use naloxone, or Narcan is what it's really commonly referred to. Narcan is the opioid overdose reversal drug. People will call it like the antidote to an opioid overdose. The first time I learned how to use it and knew that it was like a thing that could be used in the moment when someone was overdosing, I had already lost several people to overdose, right? And was told, like most people who lose people to overdose or to the harms that they experience around drug use and the war on drugs, that, well, what did you expect? You know, what did you expect to happen? This person was using drugs. This is just what happens, right? And when you're like grieving the loss of someone, you know, that's a hard thing, obviously like a hard thing to hear, and it's what gets told to us all the time. And learning how to use Narcan was like the first time I'd ever felt hope when it came to overdose. I just always assumed overdose was a death sentence. And then learning from there that we were actually, like I was learning from over a decade of activism and work by people who use drugs to make sure that Narcan got into my hands that day. And that was about 7 years ago. And now overdose has become kind of this like very nationally, widely kind of talked about thing. Narcan is, we kind of joke that, you know, Narcan and harm reduction is very sexy right now. Everybody's talking about it. And we know, right, that the more things get talked about, the more watered down they often get, and they start to lose connection to their grassroots origins and the people who are most responsible for addressing what is now referred to as the opioid crisis, lose the credit. And the original intention around the work, which was to divert resources into the hands of people who were most harmed by the system, by this racist war on drugs, was to divert resources into their hands so they did not have to engage with the system. They only had to engage with each other, and they could survive. And so for me, it's a privilege to be able to do that work alongside of them. And so that is why I stick with it, is that I've never, just the opportunity to love as deeply as we do and be a part of communities that have been taking care of themselves for a very long time in the absence of care from the system. Oh, you're on mute.
I muted myself because my dogs were barking and I didn't want to interrupt the brilliance that was coming out of you. So much to unpack, and actually I caught myself when I was introducing this series, and I saw your face twitch a little bit, and it should have, because I only said substance abuse. There's also substance use, right? Like people use drugs. Everyday people, your bakers, your teachers, your doctors, your lawyers, your moms, your dads, right? Like people use drugs, all kinds of drugs. You know, from pain pills to cocaine to whatever. And for a lot of people, it's recreational use, or spiritual use, or, you know, there's a lot of talk right now about microdosing with hallucinogens, with mental health, right? Like there's all sorts of stuff going on. I've got Narcan. I don't even know if I know anybody that's opioids, but I've got Narcan in, you know, in the living room drawer. So can you talk about that though? Can you talk about this dichotomy, right, of criminalization and the stigmatization? Is that a word? I made a word.
It is now.
Pat Brooks just made a word, y'all. Of drug use versus like the lived reality of millions of people across the planet.
Oh yeah. So the first thing I always want to get right out of the way when we're talking about drug use is literally everyone uses drugs. Everyone, right? When we talk about drug use, though, what we only talk about a very specific group of people, because actually it's never about the drug, right? When you like really start to dig deep into things, it's never about the drug. It's about who's using it, and is it regulated, right? So that speaks to like the criminalization part. And so everyone uses drugs. Like drugs are just chemicals that man-made chemicals that mimic the chemicals your body already produces. They're designed to fit into the same receptors of your brains that your naturally occurring chemicals fit into, and then you get the reaction and you feel the effect. That's what a drug is. So ibuprofen is a drug, caffeine is a drug, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, all of those things are just chemicals. And then you introduce them to your body, and then you have a chemical reaction, and then you feel the effect, right? What we talk about often when it comes to drug use, especially because our programs specifically prioritize people that are at the highest risk for overdose. And just because you use drugs doesn't mean you're going to overdose, right? All overdose actually is just a drug overwhelming the system. And so people experience overdoses all the time. But what puts them at risk for fatal overdoses and is the same thing that puts them at risk for like hypercriminalization and over-policing and incarceration, which is, are they engaged with a drug supply that is unregulated, i.e. criminalized? Because an unregulated drug supply just means you have no idea what's in it, how strong it is, and how your body's actually going to react to the specific chemical makeup of it. So all that to say, right, is anytime someone wants to talk to, especially us about overdose in San Francisco, because that's who we're serving, we're pretty quick to point out that the only reason most people want to talk to us about it is because the people that are most visibly using drugs are very poor people, people living in poverty, people who are unhoused. And because they're engaged with the only drug supply that they can access, it's an extremely inconsistent and unpredictable drug supply. Right now, it's extremely strong. And so they're at the highest risk, not just because they're using that drug supply, not because they're just engaged with that drug supply, but because they exist at all the intersections that are lining up to have like a fundamental lack of access to resources. So the way we kind of frame it is that the more resources you have, housing, community support, mental and medical health care that's like dignified and accessible, and you're engaged with drug use that isn't extremely stigmatized, i.e. like it's being prescribed to you, you're at a lower risk for overdose. Doesn't mean you're not a non-risk for overdose, but you're at a much lower one compared to what people are experiencing when they're unhoused and engaged with a street-based supply. And so it's hard, right? Because everybody, has their own opinions and thoughts and feelings about drug use that are informed by like most of us are informed by like that just say no model, where we were told like, don't just say no, but actually we share that just means just say nothing. So none of us really have like robust education around drug use. Like I can't just like go outside, hit up my dealer, and then he gives me a bindle that's like labeled with every single ingredient with like a nutritional facts breakdown like I would if I went to the cereal aisle. But I get that if I get my drugs from the pharmacy or from Walgreens, if they're regulated, right? And so, the laws that exist in this country when it comes to drugs are more about the people that are using the drugs than the actual drugs themselves. So that always speaks to me that that's not about safety at all. It's just about further criminalizing and disenfranchising communities that are already being punished by the system and being held down by a system that says that they don't deserve access to health and well-being the way that other people do. And it's almost entirely drawn down racial lines, race and class, right? So
Yeah, I want to pull that thread just a little bit more because, like, you know, I'm a Black woman, but I also sit in a privileged position. I've got health insurance. So if I, you know, if I'm having anxiety or if I can't sleep or if, you know, seeing the cops kill the umpteenth person this year or, you know, my job stresses me out, I can go to the doctor and I can say I'm having anxiety and I'm stressed and I can't sleep. Now it's harder for me than it is a white woman, but a couple of visits, you know, if I prove myself, ultimately I can get Ativan or I can get, you know, whatever the hell I want. And what we're talking about is populations of people that don't have health insurance, don't have access, who aren't believed, who are living incredibly traumatized lives, and then criminalizing them for dealing with their anxiety and their stress and their PTSD.
Yeah, in exactly the ways that everyone just wants to deal with the things that are happening. Like everyone just wants to feel good, right? And drugs make you feel good. Like that's the thing that they do. And everyone has their own ways of feeling good. And so for me, like, and I'll use myself as an example, kind of similarly, like I could walk in as a white woman, could walk into any doctor's office and say, I'm in pain and can get any script that I want. As long as I don't have like an opioid use disorder diagnosis stamped on my record, I'll be believed and I'll be given what I want in terms of dealing with pain, right? But the system has created, purposefully, intentionally created huge barriers for the vast majority of people who are in pain, who could benefit from sound medical care, to not be believed, right, when they come in. So like the example I also like to give is I worked with someone for a really long time who literally got hit by a car, went to the hospital, and simply because he was unhoused, a Black man, and had opioid use disorder stamped on his medical record, walked out with an ibuprofen script. He just got hit by a car. What is ibuprofen gonna do, right? But basically the system says, well, like, one, we don't believe your pain, and one, we don't believe your experience, and two, you don't deserve to feel good. And so what we have just done is tell that person we can't help you, and that person is going to turn to the community that they know best, where the medication they need to feel good is accessible to them. And that is our street-based drug supply, right? And so the system creates this issue for people and then punishes them for it. And that's like a deep oversimplification, but that is very much what most people who are unhoused and most people who are living at the intersections of identities that the system says, you don't get this, we don't believe you, or you'll just turn around and misuse it, sell it, like all sorts of stuff. And so what we try to do is really destigmatize the drug use, but also like the people who use drugs, right? Because we know that that's everyone, and that the only difference between the people that we're serving, again, like the only difference between the people we're serving and like the vast majority of people who use drugs, because that's the thing I always want to say, is that even though we are serving a population, a community of folks who are hyper visible because they're unhoused, so everything they do, they don't get any privacy, right? Like when I want to use drugs, I just like go into my room and close the door. And I go to my house, lock the door, and use the drug, right? And nobody's telling me that, like, there's no headline about me being like a gigantic garbage bag, which is what our people are being called all the time. But people who are unhoused don't have the privilege of privacy. So they are the most visible, and that's what people talk about when they talk about drug use, but actually they don't represent the vast majority of people using drugs. Because again, it's about the people, it's not about the drug itself. And nobody's like, you know, our police officer, like our law enforcement aren't organizing entire operations to crack down on like the powdered cocaine sellers who just like, you can text them and they'll show up and they have like a designer situation happening, but they are organizing massive operations against Black and brown people who sell drugs on the street in San Francisco, and then ensuring that they get deported, right? So it's all part of this kind of extremely like just oppressive system that puts people in this situation and then punishes them by either taking away their freedom, taking away other kind of like you can lose your housing still if you're caught using drugs. You don't get good medical care. Doctors are still telling people, well, if you stop using drugs, I will treat whatever's wrong with you, right? That kind of stuff where I'm like, that's harmful, right? That's like the nicest way I can say that.
You can cuss. We're not on KPS.
Oh, it's fucked up. It's fucked up. It's completely, it's to say that to someone where it's like, oh, you're dying of cancer. There's nothing really I can do until you stop smoking crack. It doesn't have anything to do. One doesn't have anything to do with the other. You know, like people still deserve sound medical treatment and access to services and access to care. Even if, like, no matter what they're choosing for their bodies, and that our system is not set up to address the root causes of drug use necessarily, right? Like we talked about, some people just use drugs as social engagement, to have fun, to feel good. But we also know that people use drugs to treat their trauma, to cope with some of the most unimaginable things that you could go through. And it, you know, yeah. So we say that we do that and then we punish them for it. And then we demand that they don't use it without diverting the proper resources so that they can actually have a minute to heal, so that they can actually address what's going on. Like, how could I ever tell a young woman who is experiencing homelessness, who is coming from a wildly abusive situation, who uses methamphetamine, which is a stimulant, to stay awake at night so she doesn't get assaulted, or get all of her belongings stolen from her? How could I ever tell that person that in order to heal, I need her to stop using methamphetamine when the crisis and the trauma is actively occurring? That's not how we heal. You know, that's healing can't take place like that. And so when those root causes are ignored, which the system does, because in this country especially, we're told that poverty, and all of the things therein, so in this case, drug use, are the result of an individual moral failing rather than the system being designed to literally just crush and kill people that don't fit like a very specific set of identities, i.e. white men, usually straight.
Kristen, that feels like a really good segue to, and I think you saw the same note I saw, that we've got to slow down a little bit. But let's talk about that, because, and feel free to school me, right? Clearly, there are folks that use drugs and can do so recreationally. No problem. And I think that the uptick in substance use happens, as you've very eloquently pointed out, right? How much trauma do you have in your life? What are you going through? What has your lived experience been? What resources have been made available to you to cope? And then there's folks, right, that do become severely addicted to substances. This country's, which then becomes the rallying cry that nobody should do drugs, period, because you're going to become an addict, which is just perfunctorily not true. This country's response to that has been incarcerate the addict. Can you talk about why? I mean, it seems obvious to me that this is the We Take Care of Us series. Not only why is the criminalization of addiction specifically not helpful to creating safe communities, but also what should we be doing instead?
So at its root, right, the criminalization of any decision people are making for their bodies is to punish people for the result of like a failure. Well, I don't like to say a failure of the system because we know the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. And so, you know, criminalization is punishment, and people don't want to be punished. And so, but they're also living lives where they are where they don't have access to the things that they need to survive, right? So if we don't, and so, but you're still going to use drugs, or you're still going to try to feel good, you're still going to try to cope, and so you're going to use often in secret. You're going to seek out other avenues besides going to a doctor to get the things you need. And so now you're using in secret. You are engaging with a drug supply that is not regulated. And it creates like a chaotic situation and an isolating situation. And actually, we know doing this work that one of the things that helps people survive is community, is engagement, is support. And the more you're isolated around your drug use just means the more you're isolated around your trauma. Right? And so, and then, eventually, usually it's really hard to keep secrets in communities. It's hard to stay isolated. And so it gets found out, you get punished, you get incarcerated. And we know that there's like not healing. There's no healing in a carceral system. That's not what they're designed for. And so we're just continuing to decimate, like, and then that just like plays out and ripples out into community, right? So you're like ripping people away from their community, trying to punish them, telling them they have to keep things secret, and then put them in an environment that is even more traumatizing, and stamping like something on their record that then prevents them from continues to prevent them from accessing the resources they need, like still not being able to get housing if you have a felony record, right? If you have a felony on your record, the diagnoses of substance use disorder prevents you from accessing like oftentimes good medical care because they don't trust you, so they don't believe you. And so it just ripples out in everything that we do, or every piece of people's lives is impacted by the fact that their coping mechanism, the only oftentimes for our people, especially, which are people experiencing homelessness, their only coping mechanism, the only thing that they can access that will make it just a little bit easier to be alive that day. And we're telling them that that's not okay. And while also not giving them or diverting resources or making it so that they can access, right? And so we should be doing the opposite of that. In my opinion, I think about my own kind of experiences with my family, and, there was never a moment where I doubted that my family loved me and supported me, but because of the things that they were experiencing, drugs helped them cope with those things, and they didn't, years later we know, right? They didn't know that they couldn't access certain resources because the whole world is like the whole country's kind of rhetoric is telling them that they're bad for using drugs, that it's shameful, that they should be ashamed of themselves. Again, that moral failing. You couldn't handle this by yourself. You couldn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, which is just a rhetoric that negates people's trauma and negates the structural violence that we all live under. And so in my mind, I think about, because I experienced a lot of harm in those family situations, right? Like, I don't want to deny that like there wasn't harm done, but it was because my family didn't have the resources, and some of that resource was just knowledge, knowing that there were other options, that they could maybe use drugs and also like go to therapy, that was a thing that they could do, that it's not shameful to ask for help, or like maybe
therapists. I don't mean to interrupt you because you're on this beautiful role, but I just even therapists, like, if you tell a lot of, I can't, it's not for everybody, but like for a lot of people, you go to therapy, you tell your therapist that you're using drugs or you're drinking, well, that's a drug, but like, I won't see you until you stop.
Yeah.
And then
Do that. That's bad.
and then people are like, well, then I guess I'll just go back to drinking and doing drugs because, you know what I mean? And where's the healing in that?
Exactly. And so, I mean, exactly. And that, because our public health systems, our medical care systems, our social work, the educational system, the framework that social workers and therapists and doctors and psychiatrists all learn under, is the system, is a white supremacist built system. It's a patriarchal system, and it's not built or designed by the people that it is seeking to provide care for. And so it's saying to people, listen, I get it. These are your experiences, but in order to succeed or survive in the system, you have to do these things and not the things that work for you. Right? It just negates the fact that this is a structural violence. This is like a systemic trauma, and not, again, the individual's moral failing, you know? And so most providers still operate under that system. And I think, for me, when I think about what I found when I found harm reduction, was just another set of options. And so for me, harm reduction is, we provide all of the options. We put them all in front of a person and we say, you choose. What works best for you? What feels good for you? And then letting that person decide whether they want to trust me, because that's the other piece, right? Like, the one thing most, drug using communities like often do, or communities that I like to kind of frame it as like communities that are most harmed by the racist war on drugs, right? What they don't need is like another set of like well-meaning white women to walk in and be like, we have solutions, we're here to help. They need people who have the power to divert resources, to ask, what do you need? What works for you? And to make sure that they see all of their options, because oftentimes people really are just presented with very limited options. Either quit or die. Those are the options that they're presented, but actually there's so many. And harm reduction showed me that I was operating under like a very limited set of options. And once I saw that, that there was more for people, more for me, more for my family, more for my friends, I was like, oh yeah, we got to make sure people know these options, and then actually make those options accessible, right? And make them reflect and center what that community is asking for. And so oftentimes, like, and this is the stuff I could talk about forever, but yeah, like really, yeah, being there for, like, if it's not my community, I'm not from there, but I am in a position like I am now to be like, I have these resources, but what do you need? How can I help you? And most of the time they're like, we didn't even know we had this option, is what I hear often. Like, I didn't even know this was a thing. We were all brought up under the system that says drug use is bad, don't do it. I always kind of joke that like the thing that I heard often in North Carolina, because you see those billboards of, this was a person before they started using amphetamine, and this is like 2 months after, and I'm like, first of all, those are two different people. Like, that is not even like, but they're like, one hit, addicted. And you're like, no, I mean, it's always far more complicated than that, but that's the messaging that we all get. Like, the drug is going to ruin your life. And we're like, no, poverty and racism and all of the trauma tied up in that is what ruins people's lives. And so if we can address those things at the root and say, actually, this system is designed to perpetuate the harm associated with poverty and racism, it's designed to perpetuate poverty and racism itself, then we say, fuck that system, we're going to go build our own. And I think that, you know, the communities that we serve are the best at that, because that's how you survive.
So Kristen, put that then into the context of, and you're in San Francisco, and actually I just saw in 48 Hills today, shout out to Tim Redmond, who I absolutely love for telling it like it is. But the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco actually just demanded like some massive cuts to OPD, which flying in the face of London Breed's secret deal to give them a raise in the midst of a pandemic when all other city employees are being told that they can't get their raises. And, you know, saying that she's going to cut the budget by $40 million, but then approving, I think it's like a 2% raise over 3 years. Anyway, I digress. Put this in the context of defund refund, right? Like, this is one of the areas where cops say they need the money, they need the resources. You know, there's all these awful drugs that are on the street, and these awful drug dealers and awful drug users. We need cops out there. What could we put money into instead?
The community. Like, I know it's like very simple, but like the way, and this is kind of always my pushback, right? We, as a program, as a community-based naloxone or Narcan distribution program, we prioritize putting Narcan directly into the hands of people who use drugs and their loved ones, because we know they're the first ones there. Like, I don't use drugs with cops. I don't use drugs with EMTs or my doctor or a nurse. I use drugs with other people who use drugs, or people who like me enough to let me use drugs in front of them, right? That's who we want to have Narcan, because that helps them one, it's very simple, very safe. So you can't do more harm to someone by administering it to them. So they're very capable of reversing overdoses and saving people's lives. And we know that because of that drug use, it's really, overdose is just a medical emergency. We really try to just name that. But because drugs are involved, now everybody, like your medical providers, have opinions about that medical emergency. Like, people won't hesitate to hit you with an insulin, like with insulin or EpiPen, but the second we say like, oh, and here's Narcan for an opioid overdose, people are like, isn't that just enabling?
Enable someone not to die? Yes, that's what it's doing.
And that's kind of what I say, because I'm like, we're not doing this right now, you know? But we hear that all the time. Like, that is very much kind of our constant criticism against what we do. And then we get to tell them, and they're like, well, shouldn't Narcan, it belongs with EMTs and police? And I'm like, in San Francisco, in 2019, we'll use last year as an example, SFPD reversed 135 overdoses with Narcan in San Francisco in 2019. Our EMS, so our ambulance system, our emergency medical system, so the first one was, sorry for the interpreters, San Francisco Police Department reversed 135 overdoses last year. Our emergency medical system, so our ambulances, reversed 2,265 overdoses. People who use drugs and their loved ones reversed 2,610 overdoses. So they did more, and that's about 20% of what they actually did, because we distributed 47,000 doses of Narcan into the city in 2019. And so literally you just put the numbers side by side and you can see who is doing more. And also most of those ambulance calls are overlaps. They respond to the scene and the person is already awake and breathing because community members had Narcan and knew how to use it. And so just in that example, we prove that actually we don't need those systems to survive. That people really just, if they're given the resources, and I include training and knowledge as a resource, if they're given access to those things, they can do it. They're fine. And so, you know, it's not unusual to be walking through the Tenderloin and suddenly literally hear someone yell from a street corner, I need Narcan, Narcan, and people come running, like literally running from blocks away, from from inside buildings with Narcan, and administer aid, and don't always call 911 because they don't need to. And so it is just, for me, like it always is a very clear example, just even that hard data, right? To show like the community will always take care of itself if they have the resources, but the more you try to take from them, they start to lose their ability to take care for themselves and each other. And that's actually it, that drug use and poverty, that's not a sign that people can't innately take care of themselves or that they're dangers to themselves or others. It gets used like that all the time. But that actually they are very capable and, you know, deserve access to those resources. So we like to brag about that. Those reversal numbers, we always have higher reversal numbers than SFPD or than the police department in San Francisco. They also, you know, they get the most attention. They get the most praise. You know, fun fact, they only started doing it like 4 years ago. We've been doing it for like 17 years. So, you know, so
the interpreter does that, but
I know. I mean, this year alone, January through June, we've already had 1,654 reversals reported to us from the community.
Right on. Thank you.
Over 1,600 people that are alive, you know, because people knew what to do and they had what they needed.
Right on. We've got just a few minutes left, and we actually have some great questions here. And so from John, I've got, when I was trained to use Narcan as a key harm reduction tool, I was told that after someone has had an overdose reversed, I should call 911 to get that person to the hospital. Given that we know that the cops come, especially if overdose has been mentioned, and calling 911, what is an aftercare approach to ensuring the health of the person who was in crisis that doesn't involve bringing the cops into it?
Sure. When we provide trainings, we kind of say like calling 911 is an option, but not always necessary. And so what we say is, because, you know, it is good, especially if you're not super familiar with an overdose emergency, to get medical backup in jurisdictions that are not San Francisco. So in San Francisco, police do not respond to medical emergencies, even if you say overdose now, and that's the result of work from the community. But that's not true in Oakland, right? That's not true in Alameda County. That police could be your first responders to a medical emergency. And so that's the first piece of education. Know who's going to show up. Know who you're calling to the scene. And so aftercare, after an overdose emergency, as Narcan really starts to work, the person will start to breathe again, because that's all an opioid overdose is the person just stops breathing. Narcan gets them to breathe again. They're going to wake up really disoriented, but they're going to wake up, right? And so I often, if it's me on the scene, I don't call 911 because I know how to take care of that person and am familiar with the signs of re-overdose. So if someone were to go back into the overdose after Narcan wears off. And so I'm prepared for that if I feel prepared for that. It doesn't happen often. Usually people pop up, they're on their feet, and they're out of there, and they are just fine. And so medical care, I would say, is not, it's hard, right? Because I don't want to just be like, you're good, don't call them. Every situation is different, but what you're looking for is if that person is responsive, they are breathing, they can answer questions, and they're not what we call like re-sedating after about an hour and a half, they're okay, and they don't actually need to go to the hospital. All that's going to happen in the emergency room is they're either going to be given more Narcan, which can make them more dope sick. So it's actually just, it's punitive. It's like getting punished for having a medical emergency because the side effect of Narcan is withdrawal, and probably most likely get treated like shit by someone, you know? And so it's just further traumatizing. So our recommendation is that if you do not call for an ambulance, to try to stay with the person for at least an hour and a half, to make sure that they don't go back out. And if they don't, they're fine. If they do, re-administer Narcan and stay with them again. Eventually the opioid will wear off and they will stop overdosing. And then the tactics we use if police arrive on the scene, what we really try to train people is just standing. And it's hard, right? Because for me as a white woman, it's easy for me to do the thing where I'm like, no, this is a medical emergency, you're not needed, and nobody has to give you their names. You're just here to contain the scene. That is your one job. Please do not come any closer. No, you cannot search this room, right? Like, and that's not always a privilege that everyone has, right? And so it's just knowing what your options are and knowing that that person will be safe without medical care as long as they are awake and breathing. But if there are any complications, say, 2 or 3 minutes, like you're, usually also my rule is that if I have to administer more than 3 doses, I'm going to call 911. Something else is happening that I may not be equipped to deal with. And then I'm not leaving that person. And I will stay on the scene to advocate and make sure that they're taken care of and protected. But it's hard. To be honest, there's no easy answer. We really encourage people to know the laws of their jurisdiction, and know who their first responders are and to know their rights. And that the vast majority of the overdoses that get reversed by community in San Francisco do not require medical care. They require good aftercare, right? Like really caring for that person. They just had a literal near-death experience. It's very traumatic. And so what feels more important to me often is to teach people how to provide aftercare in those moments, how to be supportive, how to give that person some space so that they can, we're like de-escalating people as they're waking up, because there is a big difference between waking up surrounded by a bunch of dudes in uniform and waking up with like your head in the lap of someone who loves you and is speaking very calmly and is just like, hey, my dear, it's Kristen. You just overdosed. I got you. You're safe. You sit up when you're ready. You can be okay. Like there's a huge difference in that experience. And that's actually what we try to focus on. Simple answer, if that person can stay breathing and is responsive, they're okay. Keep an eye on them for about an hour and a half. But if they're trying to dip, if they're trying to leave, they'll be okay.
Awesome. Kristen, there's 2 more questions here that I want to get to, but I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask mine because we hear a lot about Narcan for opiate, overdose, and I'm clear that that's what's trending right now.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more drugs out there than
Mm-hmm.
that people are doing. I think namely cocaine, right? Like
Yes.
or MDMA. what is out there for those types of overdoses, or what should people do if that happens and they really don't want to call the police, right? Because hi, yes, I've been doing lines for the last however long with this person. Now they need. Can you help me? Like nobody wants to make that phone call.
No. You know, so the thing is, Narcan is like the trending opioid crisis, and Narcan are trending mostly because Narcan feels like a very simple and easy and tangible solution to drug use, right? Because it's like right here. So we talk about it the most, but because other interventions for other drug overdoses are a little more complex and complicated, we don't talk about them as much. A lot of that I feel like is rooted in stigma around other drug use and racism, because opioid addiction is in this country, when we talk about it, is largely viewed as like a white issue. It definitely impacts everyone, but that's who is centered in that conversation. And so for other drugs, and the two drugs you named specifically are stimulants, so cocaine, MDMA, methamphetamine, those are stimulants, Adderall, Ritalin. And so for me, that goes back to the just say no just means just say nothing. I feel like it's important that if people are going to do a drug, that they should try to know what that drug is and what it's supposed to do, so that when or if you do experience adverse reactions, you and your little community have a safety plan. And I know that sounds like a little formal, but people safety plan all the time. And that actually like setting up before people start using drugs, like this is the plan. If something happens, then you just go about your business and use your drugs. And if something happens, you already have the plan. And so when we talk about cocaine overdoses, for example, what we're looking for is, so cocaine, right, impacts the cardiovascular system, it impacts the heart. And so it's more, I mean, you can definitely overdose off like a one-time deal of cocaine, but it's usually a longer term kind of scenario that impacts the heart. And so I'm looking for people who are experiencing chest and back pain that could be symptomatic of a heart attack or a cardiac event is what they're called. And then I'm trying to cool that person down, calm them down, drink some water. We're gonna stop using cocaine for right now. We're gonna
Sorry.
because like it's just like we're gonna, what, you're like sweating a lot. I'm getting, so we're just gonna pull this back. And so, but for me, like I love to party. I love being in those environments, and because I know what drugs are supposed to do, and that's the privilege of information, right? I'm gonna catch that very sweaty person and check in and be like, how are you feeling right now? And that could just be the Molly sweats, where you're just like having an excellent time, and I'll know when that person is just like, I feel great, my chest feels good, and I'm just like, I'm dancing and I'm sweaty, and I'm like, great, drink this water please. And so it's a lot more intangible kind of interventions when it comes to other drugs that we also teach people how to manage as well. But I just think opioid overdose it's just because Narcan is so tangible, but we know that there's not ever just one solution to a thing. Narcan just solves the immediate overdose emergency, but doesn't address the other things that people experience from using opioids, right? So we try really hard to broaden that and help people understand that there's interventions along a spectrum for each individual drug.
Right, it's 1:58. There's one more question though that I just, it's pulled on my heartstrings. So if you can give us a couple more minutes past 2 o'clock.
Of course.
And then for folks that got to go, thank you for joining. So last question, have you seen alternatives for rehabilitation that you can recommend? and options for supporting families and friends of addicts that you think are good. I had an addict in my life who overdosed and died, and I felt like the rehabilitation options were so out of line with what they needed/wanted. And the options of support for me are so judgmental of the addicts we love. I had to ask that question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so very sorry for your loss. There aren't a lot. I think that there aren't a lot of options. And I think that that is one of the more catastrophic things that we don't talk about often. You know, when we talk about drug treatment, rehab, what is available to people is often, and this is like a whole other, I'm sure this would be a whole other webinar if we wanted it to be, but like it's a very predatory system. It capitalizes on people's suffering. It operates in one very specific modality, which is what we call a recovery and abstinence-based framework. So it says that it's a system that still blames the individual for what's going on. And I'm not saying there's no personal accountability that people should be taking. Obviously there is, but oftentimes like that's not the cause of people's drug use. And so again, how could you expect me with all of this trauma and all of this experience that I'm still moving through to go into 30 days of rehab where I'm not allowed, or I'm told don't use any drugs, you can't, this is your path to healing. And then I leave that treatment right back into the situation that was the trigger, that was the reason I was using. And then call me a failure when I use again, deepen my shame, right? And then punish the family and the loved ones for enabling, right? Like, and so all that to say is that there aren't a lot of options. And I found when I did find options, I found them in harm reduction programs. I found, because I would consider our syringe access and like ground level harm reduction programs to be treatment, right? The treatment industry would not, because we're like literally giving people the tools they need to use drugs safely. But oftentimes engaging with those programs are people's first experiences with being validated and not shamed for the decisions they're making. And so it's hard because I wish I could just send you to a website and they would, and that's it, you know? But I found that healing and space and support in communities who were still actively using. And that was hard. It's hard. And so I know off the top of my head, we are lucky in the Bay Area to have a resource called the Harm Reduction Therapy Center, which are some of the most brilliant therapists and mental health providers I've ever had the privilege of knowing, who would take very good care of you and your family. If that was something you were interested in, if therapy was something that felt good. And you can go to their website and engage with them. And, you know, but finding community groups, your needle exchange. You have the HIV Education Prevention Project of Alameda County is one. And so is West Oakland Punks with Lunch.
Love them.
Both of those groups do frontline support for people who use drugs and people experiencing homelessness in Oakland. And then Berkeley also has a program. San Francisco has a very robust network of programs. And you'll find your people. And also, if you want, whoever you are, you can also contact me. And I would be happy to talk you through anything more specific. I think a lot of what we do in the absence of a system that doesn't give a shit about us, we give a shit. And so I would be more than happy to hold space for you around that, because it's a tough thing to go through.
I say this at the end of every webinar. This was the best one. This was the best one. And, you know, we're so committed both at Justice Teams Network and also at APTP to a healing justice framework, right? In all of the things that that means. And this to me just feels like so firmly rooted in healing justice work for our people. And so thank you, Kristen, for joining us. Thank you for your work, your commitment to the people, and for spending time with me and us today. This was I could like talk to you for another hour, like legit.
But I know I could do this all day. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm gonna have you on the KPFA show. I'm not done with you yet. We gotta get this word out about what's happening. And you know, we're building APTP, you know, we're launching our model for mental health response. JTN's working on a formalized model for IPV response. Would love to talk to you about like, what is the model for community response and how do we advocate for funding to go there instead of police? Such important.
Absolutely.
It's literally saving lives. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody who tuned in. This is the last of season 1. We Take Care of Us series. We will be back in January. If you have ideas for other models where we see communities taking care of community crisis or community issues without law enforcement in ways that do not lead with law enforcement, which, you know, we've been doing for hundreds of years in our various cultural and ancestral lineages, hit us up, because that's the things we want to promote with this series. And it actually really does help the defund movement, because the more that we can show people, right, because so many people, like, we're ingrained from the time that we're babies, right, that law enforcement is what keeps us safe, that cops get the kiddies out of the tree, and that's who you call here in danger, which is, you know, creates absolute cognitive dissonance for those of us that are of color and or poor, or both, which is usually the case. So the more that we can show people that there are models like what Kristen is doing, there are models for mental health response, there are models for all kinds of domestic violence, like all of it, the more we can build the movement we need to defund and refund. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Bye.
Thank you.